All right. Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be with you today to discuss the work that Dean and I have done on populism, nationalism, and religion. This is a kind of a new sort of interest of mine. Part of it comes from the fact that at so many of these presentations of our work, mostly on populism and nationalism, there's always coming questions about, well, what about religion? What about social conservatism? What about the other things that typically go along with these two, especially when we're talking about right-wing populism? And so this kind of motivated this project, which we're still in the kind of opening stages of. And hopefully, I'm hoping that we can expand on this. But I also want to give a nod to Jolt because he in his office, I first came with this idea. I don't know if you remember this three-dimensional figure of nationalism, populism, and social conservatism, and the idea that if you trace parties, even governments over time, that they often you will find a sort of a convergence along these three dimensions. And so this is a kind of a first test of the face validity of this idea. And we're sort of playing around with a lot of concepts. So I know that there are scholars of conservatism and liberalism in the audience. Please bear with me because we're mostly engaged in a kind of like a brush clearing kind of thought experiment to see, does this idea have legs? Let's see. Okay, so a little bit more about the motivation, just kind of in the world, right? So first of all, it's no surprise to anybody, and I'm sure everyone can agree in the audience here, that there's been a rise in the level of populism and nationalism in the speech of politicians, including chief executives, what Kirk works on. And this is just a short list of some of the authors who have written about this kind of this increase. So here I'm bringing kind of nationalism into the picture, but all of these scholars, notably Brubaker, Stavrakakis, and DeClean and Bonikowski, have all written extensively on the intersection between populism and nationalism in discourse. Okay, and there's also seems to be there's been a rise in religious nationalism. So, and we can even see there's a new section in the International Studies Association on basically religion. This is in the last 10 years. So there has been an increase in interest in the study of religion by IR scholars. So that, I think, tells us that religion may be playing a more kind of systematic role in the way that we talk about politics more generally. What I think is interesting, and what Dean and I, was a little bit of a sort of spoiler alert, what I think is interesting is if you think about this triadic formation of populism, nationalism, and religion, typically you hear about religious nationalism, but you don't hear too much about religious populism. And if you do an n-gram search on Google, you'll find that most of the references to religion is related to more nationalism and less to populism. So this is one of the kind of hypotheses that we come into this project with. And there has also been, as all of you know, increased polarization in political systems around the world, but particularly among kind of like more industrialized societies. And further, it's asymmetric typically, so meaning that we see more polarization on one side, typically the right, than the other. That's why there's so much more work on right-wing as opposed to left-wing populism. And in fact, you can see the increase in this asymmetric polarization in the US in roll call votes in the U.S. Congress, where you can see much more much more extreme positions taken by Republican representatives than Democratic representatives. There has been polarization also on the left. I don't want to negate that reality, but much more on the right, and therefore we can call this asymmetrical polarization. So that's why the focus on the right. But we don't really know what this looks like rhetorically or sounds like, and we don't know also what this looks like mostly out of Western Europe and North America. This is where most of the people do work on, especially populism. It's almost always, Western Europe, maybe Eastern Europe, and, North America. So we brought in a couple extra cases here. And also, we don't know whether far-right leader rhetoric is reflected in party rhetoric or is instead confined to the leader, the chief executives themselves. So we're focused on how parties talk in parliamentary debates. So this is the corpus that we're going to be focusing on in this work. Okay, so here comes this concept. Fun. It's always fun to come up with these concepts. Not that this is a new idea, but I want to invite you to kind of wrap your head around this idea of a new political conservatism. So traditionally, political conservatism has been sort of, at least in the US and most of the West, has mostly been about economic issues, right? The focus on market liberalization, privatization, the kinds of stuff that von Hayek wrote about, Milton Friedman. These are kind of the classic kind of economic liberalism, or actually conservatism, what we consider to be conservative thinkers. But the new political conservatism is more along the lines of what Liliana Mason has called mega identities. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the concept or read her book. But it's this notion that you have these political affiliations that fuse identities across multiple domains. So it's not just political, but it's also religious, it's social, right? And so this assists polarization greatly because it better segments people into one camp or another, these mega identities. And to think about this, I draw on this very interesting article written by Benjamin DeClean in the Journal of Political Ideologies. And he is basically talking about political conservatism or conservatism as a political logic, right? So what is this? So this comes from the Essex School of the Discourse theoretical approach, where Glynis and Howard talk about this as an articulation of demands as being a matter of conservation, an effort to ensure the continuity of the social order between the past, present, and the future. Okay. Where such continuity exists, political conservatives support conservation. Where it has been disrupted, political conservatives advocate radical change. And that's how you can get sometimes political conservatives who are kind of more like, let's do incrementalism, or let's not change anything at all, versus others that say, no, we need a revolution, right? It all depends on the extent to which there has been continuity, a line drawn between the past, present, and future in terms of a social order. Okay. So this new political conservatism militates against the perceived loss of rootedness that comes from alienation and anomie due to rapid societal change. It calls for the end to progressivism, cosmopolitanism, and globalization. Such programs resonate strongly with the left-behind political base that respond to local traditional identity appeals such as ethno-nationalism and religious or social conservatism that together reject the rootlessness of modernity. So these are basically kind of anti-modern sort of calls, an anti-modern ideology. Okay, so moving on. So how do we get to this kind of political conservatism? How do we get to these mega identities, these fusions across multiple domains that kind of sort people into one camp or the other? So Cass-Muta talks about a couple different pathways. One, his argument for how these types of party formations emerge in societies. One is you might have a completely new party. A completely new party might emerge and kind of suck out the supporters from these traditional conservative parties. The second pathway, and one that we're more interested in, is the mainstream conservative party becoming much more radical. Okay, so that's what we want to trace over time. That's what we're after. Okay. And here again, we argue with de Kleen that political conservatism follows a political logic that seeks to conserve/restore the old social order. In other words, again, it could be pro-status quo or it can be pro-revolution, depends on the context. Okay. So what we see in all of these appeals that kind of pulls these sort of discourses together into a kind of a singular sort of like blob discourse is this kind of hyper localization, this idea that the power should be restored to the people, to the family, to traditional social structures. It should be pulled away from international organizations. It should even be, in some cases, pulled away from the state. And these institutions need to be divested of their power in order to achieve this hyper localization. Patternistically, in rhetoric, we expect to see a temporal rise in the frequency of populist, nationalist, and religious discourses, and playing around with whether social conservatism might sort of be a stand-in for religious discourse. We haven't probably going to test both of these possibilities. Okay. And what we're testing for is whether we can see a kind of a closing of semantic space between these three discursive frames. All right, so a couple more points on research design, and then I'm going to hand the time over to Dean to talk more about how the analysis was structured and the results, since he did this part. Yeah, good. Okay, so what we're doing is analyzing 3 different countries and 3 mainstream conservative parties in the US, Turkey, and Israel. The idea is to get different sort of religious sort of contexts, to see if this is a general pattern and not just one in Christian countries or Muslim countries or the one case of a Jewish nation. So we chose these 3 cases following the principle of most different systems design, 3 different political systems featuring different faith traditions, geopolitical settings, and levels of development. And we use the following approach. So we first have these dictionaries that we created. We've spent a lot of time, using AI to come up with, and then other published work to see, what terms are associated with each of these discourses. So we have these 3 different dictionaries. And then Dean, I shouldn't say we, but Dean, collected statements from AKP party members in the Turkish parliament, Likud party members in the Knesset, and Republicans in the US Congress. And the observations are for each year between 2012 and 2022 in Turkey, from 81 to 2017 in the US Congress, so a very long period of time, and 92 to 2024 in the Israeli Knesset. So I'm going to give the time over to Dean to talk more about these and just kind of the approach. Dean, can you?
Yes, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Great. Yeah, so first of all, I wish I was in the room with you all. Unfortunately, so instead I'm in the US Deep South at Mississippi State, joining you from there. But so thank you for allowing me to co-present. I'll just, I guess, Erin, I'll ask you to kind of change slides from time to time, if that's okay. All right, so we have research design. We have 2 ways of measuring speech to help operationalize these questions. And so we're interested in the party year, right? We have data sets that cover a few decades for some of these parties. A bit of a shorter timeline with the Turkish parliament, about 10 years or so. But so first is we're measuring these discourses using frequency. So this is the relative use of terms that belong to these three different discourses, populism, nationalism, religiosity. And so this is really measuring how likely, when actors are talking, they are to use words in these dictionaries. So this is a measure of salience or of importance. So how important these discourses are for each party. And then we have semantic convergence. And so this is done taking the speeches from each party year, creating a vectorized multidimensional representation of these speeches. And so you have this kind of multidimensional space where you can measure then how close and how far away these discourses are from each other. And so then this is measuring then when one discourse is being used, how likely is another discourse to be used together with that discourse? So this is a measure of then, convergence of different kinds of rhetoric, different kinds of discourses. So we have these two measures, importance and then or saliency, but then also convergence. Okay, that's next slide. Oh, perfect. Right. So now we have the dictionary terms. This is the terms that we use to operationalize these three different discourses: populism, nationalism, religion. How we came up with these dictionaries is derived from previous work developing similar dictionaries, including work by Mersch and Schneider. Also work that I did with Franziska Wagner and Mehmet Yavuz, working with Jolt's Authorlib project. So hopefully these terms are intuitive. We did also, I conferred with Erin also in choosing them. But so populism, we have things like, people, elite, the global ruling establishment, these kinds of terms. Nationalism is homeland, motherland, nation, territory. And religiosity was tailored a little bit to each country because you have a different religious context, right? Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. So sometimes we used, words like temple or mosque or church, depending on the country context. So those changed a little bit. But otherwise, we have these religious terms for the religious discourse. So those are the terms we used as the basis for our analysis to measure frequency, salience, and convergence. Right. And so we have this kind of time series for frequency or salience for each of the three countries. This is the first one looking at the US Congress. And the most marked change is the increase in salience of the populist discourse in the US Congress. This is among Republicans, going from 1997, the 97th Congress to the 114th Congress. This is 2017. This is the most recent data that I could get to. Nationalism, religiosity, this discourse, they don't increase that much over this time period. So it's really, you see an increase in populist discourse happening. I can imagine it would continue much more dramatically even under Trump's term and then into now. Similarly, in Likud in the Knesset, more recently, a quite dramatic increase in populist discourse. Again, nationalism, religiosity, not so much of a change. So we see a similar pattern in Israel and in the US. Then moving to Turkey. Turkey is a little bit of the outlier. And this, maybe it could be because of the shorter timeline. Maybe rhetoric was already quite populist, so you missed the opportunity to see an increase in the populist rhetoric, because we're missing the early period of the AKP's entry into government, starting off in 2002 to 2012. It's a pretty dramatic time where the AKP started off much more careful, measured in its speech, but then by 2012, 2013, you're already getting into the Gezi Park protests and to the authoritarian crackdown. So it might be that the timeline is cutting off what would be an earlier, more measured period of the AKP's rhetoric. But really with them, we see, some increase in populist rhetoric, maybe, but much more leaning on increased usage of nationalist rhetoric. So now we get into, this is using cosine similarity to measure convergence between different discourses. And so these are paired measurements. So like measuring national and religious rhetoric, populist and national rhetoric, and populist and religious rhetoric. So these are paired comparisons to see if these two types of discourses are co-occurring more often over time. And so in the US Congress, over the course of this nearly 40 years, what we see is starting around 2000, a dramatic increase in nationalist and religious rhetoric co-occurring together, but also broadly, all of these rhetorics are co-occurring more often. So populist and nationalist and populist and religious are all co-occurring. Similar pattern in the Knesset. Again, nationalists and religious being the most commonly co-occurring, followed by populist and nationalist. And so again, third in line, populist, religious. There is some increase in their co-occurrence, but less so, less dramatic, less marked. And again, the outlier, the AKP in Turkey, an increase in populist religious rhetoric co-occurring together, nationalist religious rhetoric co-occurring together, but populist and the other two discourses staying pretty much flat in their co-occurrence. So again, Turkey, the behavior there is a bit different from Israel and the US, which are more similar.
Okay, thank you, Dean. I'm just going to
Yeah.
close by saying, since we've run out of time, that you can see, I think, in all of these, a notable increase in populist rhetoric, the frequency of populist rhetoric, but also an increasing semantic convergence between religious and nationalist rhetoric, much more than the other two combinations. Right, the convergence across all three pairings can be seen, but not so much in the AKP rhetoric. So I think what this shows is that populism and populist discourse is a little bit kind of orthogonal to nationalism and religion, right? That are much more commonly co-articulated. And I think this serves as a demonstration of the importance and value of the concept of religious nationalism. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dean.